In the name of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. The philosopher Martin Heidegger used the term throneness to suggest what all of us experience, that we are in some sense thrown into the world. None of us chose to come in the 20th or 21st centuries. None of us chose even our parents. In some sense, we occupy a place that is strange for us, and we have to learn something about it, and it takes a long time. I was inclined to think about Martin Heidegger and thrownness when Robert Fruworth asked me to deliver the sermon on this particular Sunday. He didn't know that I had had some special experience with Jonathan Marek Daniels when I was a young man of 30, which seems to me now to be impossibly young. In any case, I did know John Daniels, as did Bruce Lawrence, our colleague and good friend and fellow parishioner, and Ran Hamner, our good colleague and fellow parishioner. Ran was a first-year student at the Virginia Military Institute when Jonathan Marek Daniels was a senior. And though he didn't know John all that well, so he tells me, he was nonetheless greatly impressed by him. And in particular, that John, who had no athletic prowess, he was smart, he was articulate, but nonetheless, he was chosen to be the valedictorian of his graduating class. He had decided he wanted to go to Harvard University to work for a graduate degree. So he came to Cambridge, Massachusetts. Now, John was a native of Keene, New Hampshire. His father was a doctor, and his mom, a wonderful person who worked for her church and her community. I think they were Congregationalist, but even when he was at home before he had gone to college, John was drawn to the Episcopal Church. And although he, as many of us do, he dropped out of church for a while, not quite sure what was going on. And then he went to Harvard in the graduate program in English and found himself just in a fit of depression. He came out of it largely through the ministry of a particular church in that diocese of Massachusetts, the Church of the Advent, fairly well known because it was distinctively the most smoke and bells church of the area. And that appealed to John. He loved the high church character of the Church of the Advent. And so he became active in that church. And it was, I'm pleased to mention now, it was really the Magnificat that we just said ourselves in this service. It was the Magnificat that struck him with particular power. He had a kind of conversion experience at the Church of the Advent and decided that he was called to give his life to Christ his Lord. Then he entered the Episcopal Theological School in Cambridge, Massachusetts. He had been there for a year and was beginning his second year in 1964 when I arrived to be a lowly instructor in theology and ethics at the Episcopal Theological School. I, through the wisdom of the dean and others, I didn't have much specific responsibility to lecture, but I was privileged to be one of the people who helped with the seminar groups, and in particular, those small groups for discussion related to the course, the Midler course, the second year course in which John was enrolled in Introduction to Theology. So I got to know John as a particularly articulate and bright and lovely young man. So that was, I remind you, the fall of 1964 when I arrived and first met John Daniels. I'm going to be talking in the rest of this sermon about John, and it's kind of a biographical report about John, but it's also something of an autobiographical report to you, which I'm offering as the contents of this sermon. Because John's experience over that next year, up until his death on August the 20th of 1965, John's experience, I think, might be as instructive to you as it has been to me across my whole life. We fast forward to March of 1965. You will undoubtedly, because of the news reports of the past several weeks, you will undoubtedly remember the videos shown over and over of the state troopers, the police, attacking the marchers who attempted to march from Selma, Alabama to Montgomery, Alabama on March the 7th of 1964. It came to be known as Bloody Sunday, and John Lewis was in the lead for that march. The police who were using their billy clubs fractured John Lewis's skull in that attack, with leaving scars that were obvious right on until John Lewis's death just a couple of weeks ago. There were 3 attempted marches from Selma to Montgomery in March of 1964. The second was led by Martin Luther King Jr. And it was aborted because he had been given orders not to continue with the march. So the marchers went across the Edmund Pettus Bridge and stopped and went back over and back into Selma. But Martin Luther King issued an appeal to anybody who was willing to do so, to come and join the civil rights activists working for civil rights for Black Americans, for colored Americans, for all Americans. And that appeal was heard by several of the students at the Episcopal Theological School, including John. I heard it too. It was an appeal being made from my own native Southland. Now, I was born and raised in Asheville, North Carolina, which arguably, I have to confess this, arguably isn't as south as some other parts of American Southland. But it was nonetheless my territory. It was a part of the Confederacy 150 years ago. So I was tempted to go, but I had not finished my doctoral dissertation. I felt obligated to the school that had just employed me. So I didn't go. But John and several other students did go. In particular, among those students, a young woman named Judith Upton. So they went down, and they were there for the third march from Selma to Montgomery. And while they were there, they had the experience of knowing that on March the 11th, a Unitarian minister named James Reeb was attacked and murdered on the streets of Selma, Alabama, because he was there as a civil rights activist. They did the march in their own special way. They did some of it and then went back to Selma and then caught up with the march again in order to complete it when they got to Montgomery. But they were aware that on the last day of the march, another activist who had joined them, whose name was Viola Liuzzo, a housewife from Detroit, Michigan, who was used a car to help ferry marchers back and forth. She was in her car ferrying an African-American man who was in the march, and a Ku Klux Klansman drove up beside them and shot her while she was driving, killed her instantly. They knew that back in February before the marches started, a young man named Jimmy Lee Jackson had been brutally murdered nearby. And all of that, of course, was subsequent. All of the march, all these murders I've just mentioned, they were subsequent to the murder of Emmett Till back in the 1950s, and the murder in 1964 of James Earl Chaney and Andrew Goodman and Michael Schwerner in Mississippi, done by Klansmen who plotted it and buried their bodies in the earthworks of a dam. Those of us who remember the 1960s, and that I know that doesn't include most members of St. Matthew's Church, but those of us who do remember those days remember just how frightening they were, how full of ugliness and meanness. Now, John had gone and joined that march. He came back. It was in the middle of his spring semester of his Midler year, his second year at the Episcopal Theological School. He appealed to the faculty to permit him and Judith Upton also entered the appeal to let them go back to Selma for the rest of the semester. And they promised they would write up their experiences as term papers and return, which they did. They lived with families, African-American families in Selma. They they attempted while they were there to go to the Episcopal Church in Selma, along with their African-American hosts, but were turned away, refused admittance, asked not to make trouble. So they came back in May of 1964 to take their final exams and submit their term papers. And that was my last, their being there occasioned my last conversation with John Daniels, who I had come to know and admire for his intelligence, his kindness, his goodness. And we had a particular intense conversation on one day while they were back. But then he left to go back to Selma and to continue working for voting rights for African Americans and for the general civil rights of all people. It was on August the 14th that John, of that summer, when John joined a group of students who were organized by the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee to attempt a demonstration in a town in the county right next to the county where Selma, Alabama was located. It was in Lowndes County, and they were to go to Fort Deposit in Lowndes County for this demonstration. I think it's important for us all, for you to know, as it is important to me to know, that the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee had only been organized 1 year before, and the leader of that committee was John Lewis. So John Lewis came to know John Daniels. And John Lewis, so far as I know, was not a part of the demonstration that John was a part of in Fort Deposit. But on August the 14th, those demonstrators went to Fort Deposit. They were not there long. The police arrested them. I don't know exactly what the charges were. Some charge of disorder. 29 of them had gone there. Among them was a man whose name many of you will remember. His name was Stokely Carmichael. But they were, the 29 of them were arrested. 5 of the 29 were so young that even the police officers who were doing the arresting dismissed them and sent them away. I don't know how they got back to Selma, but 24 of them were loaded into a garbage truck and taken to another nearby Alabama city named Hayneville, where they were jailed and spent 6 days in jail. So the demonstration was on August the 14th, and that's the reason that John Marek Daniels is in our church calendar. If you look at page 27 of the Book of Common Prayer, you would find in our church calendar that's the Saints' Day, our equivalent of the Saints' Day for John Marek Daniels. But he and the other 24 were jailed for 6 days. John shared a cell with Stokely Carmichael for those 6 days. They became good friends after initially having some friction with one another. Suddenly, and that was a Saturday when they were arrested. So it was the following Friday on March the 20th that suddenly, without any prior notice, they were released from jail. Many of us believe that they were released at that time precisely because of what happened to John later on after their release. They, in effect, came staggering out of jail. The conditions had been miserable in jail, miserable. The food was miserable. And the weather was hot and humid as it can get in the American South in August. Several of them kind of stood around as one went to try to contact someone to come get them. John and 3 other activists went together to a nearby store that was well known that it would serve African Americans as well as whites, in order to buy a cold drink. The 3 included a Roman Catholic priest who was about John's age. John was 26 at the time. Richard Morris Rowe, the Roman Catholic priest, was about the same age. They had with them Joyce Bailey and Ruby Sales, who were African American young people. I know that Ruby Sales was 17. I don't know what Joyce Bailey's age was. As they approached the store, Tom Coleman, a deputy sheriff, who had already once, a few years earlier, killed a man allegedly in the line of duty, but he was a black man. And Tom Coleman confronted them with his 12-gauge shotgun. He also had a pistol on his hip. He leveled the shotgun at them, and with profanities that I will not repeat right here, told them to get away. Then he aimed the gun directly at Ruby Sales. John pushed her out of the way and stepped in front of the gun and took the shot that Tom Coleman fired out of one of the barrels. And it killed John Daniels instantly. Richard Morris Rowe grabbed the hand of Joyce Bailey, and they turned and tried to get away. Coleman fired a second shot, and the result was that Richard Morris Rowe was paralyzed from the waist down and had several operations. He's still living, so far as I know. I met him personally just 5 years ago. Janet and I together had gone to an observance of the 50th anniversary of John's death. But what I want you to know is that across that whole period of time, especially, John had a strong sense of call. He felt that when he was in Selma, working with the family that hosted him, whose name was West, an African-American family that hosted him, and had several children, that while he was there working with those children and doing work for the civil rights of people, he was the happiest he had ever been in his life. He was doing what he knew himself to have been called to do. It was the right thing for him to do. And his action in saving the life of Ruby Sales was all of a character with that. It was John being who he had been formed by Christ to be, with all the consequences. And I think it's important for us to know these stories, a story like this, because we are, all of us, thrown into the world. We have our own circumstances. We have our own struggles to figure out just what we are called to do and be, what it means to love our neighbor as ourselves, which is another way of saying to love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. I search myself. I don't mind just saying out loud to you that Janet and I have made some pretty searching decisions recently about befriending African Americans whom we know. And part of my search has to do with finding some way to reconcile the fact that my own family on one side, the Norris family, my name is Carl Norris Edwards, the Norris family, located in Holly Springs, North Carolina, owned slaves. The first slave in my family history was named Dread, spelled D-R-E-A-D, and I know that only because African Americans were property, as you know, and therefore there are deeds of sale that enable us to find out information like the name of a slave. One of my ancestors gave to another ancestor. The recipient of this gift was 1 year old at the time he got it. It was his grandfather who gave to him a slave named Doll, whom my own grandfather probably knew and was in part raised by. So I have this particular struggle, and I mention it here only to say that in simple fact, by the fact that we live where we do in Chapel Hill and Hillsborough, North Carolina, there are people whom we know who are African American, and my solid guess is that most of you, like me and Janet, don't have any really close African American friends. Now, I've made friends with African Americans across my whole lifetime. I was raised in large part by one whose name was Hattie Bell Johnson. But what I'm saying is that when I report to you that John Daniels had found his calling, he was doing what he knew he had been called to do. And his bravery, because he had searched so deeply for what it meant to love neighbor as self, his bravery was all of a piece of that. That's a way of becoming a saint. And in some sense, it's what we're all called to be. We are the saints of God. We're going to go marching in. And I simply want to close by using a sort of benediction that John himself used. There is a film that has been made of John's life by two instructors at the Keene State University in New Hampshire. The title of it is "Here Am I, Send Me." And it includes John himself, a wonderful photograph of John, with Sam Waterston reading what John actually said in this benediction. And here it is. I close these comments by citing it for you. We too can set our faces to go to Jerusalem as Jesus has gone before, to preach good news to the poor, to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed, and to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord. We go to stand with the poor, the captives, the blind, the oppressed, the hungry, the homeless. We go in active non-resistance, not to confront, but to love and heal, to heal and to free. That's our calling, as it was John's. And to God be all honor, glory, dominion, and power, now and forevermore. Amen.